Hey, all you change makers. Miss Susan here for chapters 7 and 8 of George Brown Class Clown, the second book in Nancy Krulik's series called Trouble Magnet. Now, you don't have to read all of these books in order, but it is kind of fun if you want to read them that way. But if you haven't read the first one, I would definitely suggest checking it out somewhere, maybe your local library or a local bookstore if maybe you do chores and earn some money, right? So far, if you've been reading along with us, George is having these magical burps, and they tend to get him in trouble. So far, he is working on a research project for Hawaii or about Hawaii, and they want to make this a volcano. And there's also a school talent show going on, and George wants to be in the talent show or help with it. He's gotten in trouble in the past, and so he thought maybe if I volunteer to help, they'll see that I'm a good person and I can be a good person and show them, how responsible I am, So let's get started with chapter 7 and 8 of Trouble Magnet. Keep in mind, guys, we are paying attention to the characters, the setting, the plot, the conflict or the problem in the story, and the theme. What theme is the author trying to inform us about? What do they want us to learn from the story? By the time we get done reading the story, what does Nancy Krulik want us to know? All right, so we are on chapter 7. And I'm looking at the picture because good readers always look at the pictures and they read the pictures and they say, what can I learn from the picture? So I'm looking at, they have their volcano and they've got some little figurines here. Remember, Alex said he would bring us figurines to make the volcano look lifelike and have people there. And it looks like they're getting ready to maybe do something with their project. So let's get started. Chapter 7. Okay, this guy can go over here, Alex said. He put an action figure near the base of the volcano he and George had built. It was a Saturday morning, and they were putting the finishing touches on their Hawaii project. You're putting R2D2 in a Hawaiian village? George asked Alex. He's a robot. But he's broken, so I don't care if he gets messed up, Alex said. I guess it will work, George said. Once the volcano erupts, you won't be able to see him or any of that village. That's kind of a bummer, Alex said. We worked so hard on it this week. George nodded. They had done lots of research on Mauna Loa, the largest volcano in the world. Building the volcano and village hadn't been easy because Louis had called about 1 million band rehearsals. It had been a long week, but at least George had been burp free. Remember, he gets into trouble when he has his burps. Erupting is what volcanoes do, George told Alex. They explode and destroy. Kapow! Kapow! Alex repeated. You're sure about how much baking soda and cherry jello powder to pour into the vinegar? Exactly half of this bag, George said, holding up a plastic bag filled with jello powder and baking soda. Any less, and it won't explode. Any more, and we'll make a major mess. This is going to be so cool, Alex said. I can't wait until Monday morning. George nodded. When this volcano erupts, everyone is going to totally freak. All right. Some leis are made from flowers. See, this is a lei in case you're not sure what it is. It's a necklace that you put around your body and it's made with flowers. Others are made from seashells or feathers. I didn't know that. You can learn anything in a book, can't you? Others are made from seashells and feathers, Sage said as she gave her report to the class on Monday morning. She had a lei around her neck. When someone gives you a lei, it is supposed to show that they like you. George put his hand over his mouth to hide a yawn. Sage's report was boring. Louis's report on ukuleles hadn't been much better. In fact, so far, the only report that had been kind of cool was Juliana's about poi. Poi was this soupy, puddingy mush that was made of the root of some plant. Juliana had made enough for everyone to try, and the way you ate it was by scooping it up with your fingers. It didn't taste bad for something that looked pretty nasty. George thought the poi looked a little like the George soup he used to make during lunchtime at his old school, especially the kind where he mixed the fruit punch, vanilla pudding, and salad dressing. Then he was really goofing. Oh, sorry, I read the wrong word. Let me go back and reread that because I want to make sure that my story makes sense. When he was really goofing off, he used to stick some of his action figures in the George soup to pretend they were stuck in quicksand. Good times. Today, those same action figures were really going to get it just as soon as the volcano exploded. Finally, it was George and Alex's turn. They carried their volcano to the front of the room. George placed it on the table and stood back. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the container of secret erupting powder. You can see it there in the picture. At the end of Alex's report on the Mauna Loa volcano, George was going to pour half of the powder into the bottle of vinegar that was hidden inside the volcano and make it erupt. The Hawaiian Islands were all created by volcanoes, Alex said. They start from hot spots deep in the earth. A stream of superhot rock called lava was forced from the hot spot. This caused volcanoes to form. Now let's stop for a moment and make a prediction. What do you think might happen soon? Do you think the project is going to go well? Let's see. Let's see if what you think is going to happen will happen. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to make a prediction or an educated guess about what's going to happen in a story. And it's okay to be wrong. You know, if you're wrong, you just go back and you change your prediction. Okay. George stood there quietly, listening to Alex speak. Suddenly, he felt something weird in the bottom of his belly. It was a fizzy feeling, like a million soda bubbles were bouncing around in there. Oh no, not the super burp. He'd been burpless for a week. How could this be happening now? Did you guys say that you thought he might have a burp and cause trouble? If so, you were right. Your prediction was right. If your prediction was wrong, that's okay. Not a big deal. This volcano is called Mauna Loa, which means long mountain in Hawaiian. Alex read from his paper. It's the largest volcano on our planet. George couldn't pay attention to what Alex was saying. He couldn't pay attention to anything but the burp swelling inside him, the super burp. It was back, and it wanted out. Already, the bubbles were bing-bonging in George's belly and ping-ponging their way up into his chest. Mauna Loa has erupted 39 times since 1832, Alex continued. Its most recent eruption was 1984, and scientists say it is sure to erupt again. George had to stop that burp. He just had to. He shut his lips tight and held his nose. Then he swallowed really hard, trying to force the burp back down his throat. But the super burp was strong. It had been kept down for too long. It needed to break free. Burp! The biggest burp in the world erupted. A super colossal Mauna Loa sized burp. A burp so loud it could probably be heard all the way across the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii. Alex stopped talking and stared at George. The kids all started laughing. Mrs. Kelly stood up. Quiet, class, she said. I'm sure George didn't mean to do that. That was sure the truth. George opened his mouth to say, "Excuse me," but nothing came out. Instead, His hands started moving. It was like they had a mind of their own. They popped off the top of the container they had been holding. There was no way to stop them from pouring all of the secret erupting powder into the volcano. George! Alex shouted. What are you doing? You're only supposed to put in half of the powder. Alex never finished his sentence. The volcano began to shake. It began to tremor, and then kapow! The volcano erupted. Ruby red lava gel shot way up in the air. Now George's feet wanted to have some fun. They began to leap up and down like they were on fiery coals. Hot, hot, George's mouth shouted out. Hot lava. George began to roll on the floor under the shower of vinegar, jello, and baking soda lava. Oh no, I'm being buried by lava, he shouted. George, what are you doing? Mrs. Kelly scolded. She pulled a tissue out from her sleeve and wiped lava splatters from her glasses. This is a science project, not the talent show. But George couldn't stop himself. He wasn't in charge of his own body. The super burp was. And the super burp wanted George to roll around on the floor. Hot lava, he shouted. Help! Whoosh! Suddenly, George felt something pop in his belly. It was kind of like a balloon being punctured with a needle. All the air rushed right out of him. The super burp was gone. But George was still there, in front of the classroom, on the floor, with red lava all over the place. He opened his mouth to say, I'm sorry. And those were exactly the words that came out. What were you thinking? Mrs. Kelly asked. How are they feeling? I see some different emotions on these people's faces. So if you look at George, how do you think he's feeling? Maybe kind of sad or embarrassed even? Because he didn't really want to do that, did he? How about Alex? Look at Alex's body language, his arms, his face. How do you think he's feeling? He looks kind of angry, doesn't he? Yeah, maybe he's angry at George. Maybe he's afraid that he's messed up the project. Would you be angry if a teammate messed up your project? How about the teacher, Mrs. Kelly? Does she look happy? Nah, she's not happy. She looks like she is really upset with him. Let's find out what happens next. She didn't sound angry. She sounded disappointed. That was worse. George knew he'd better not say that he wasn't thinking. That was the kind of answer that could get a kid in even more trouble. So instead, he said, I guess I was trying to show how sometimes volcanoes can erupt without warning. I didn't mean to mess up the classroom. That was the truth. He hadn't. Mrs. Kelly sighed. It's true that volcanoes can erupt suddenly, but I don't think what you did was the best way to demonstrate that. I'm really sorry, Mrs. Kelly, George said. He looked down at the gooey, red mess in front of him. Mrs. Kelly looked puzzled and shook her head. That's a start, she told him. Shouldn't you also tell Alex you're sorry? After all, he worked hard on this project. I'm really sorry, dude, George said to Alex. I didn't mean to ruin everything. Alex didn't answer. George could tell he was really mad. Nothing George could say or do was going to make this better right now. Sadly, George looked up at Mrs. Kelly. I guess I'll go find Mr. Coleman and get a mop, he told his teacher. It's going to take a while to clean up this mess. Miss Kelly shook her head again. I honestly don't know why you do these things, George. George knew why, but he didn't know why the Superbird picked him of all kids in the world as the victim. It wasn't fair, not at all. George skateboarded home from band rehearsal later that day. He was really lonely. Even people on the street seemed to move far away from him. Of course, that was probably because they didn't want to crash into him, or maybe because he smelled nasty, like old salad. salad dressing from the vinegar and jello that had been in his hair. As George turned the corner and skated onto his block, he spotted Chris and Alex tossing a ball around on Alex's front lawn. George could tell they both saw him. He could also tell from Alex's face that he didn't want anything to do with George right now. Yo, George, Chris called out. Want to throw a ball around with us? George looked over at Alex. Okay with you? He asked. Alex just shrugged. Whatever. I really am sorry about today, he said. It was about the 10th time he said it. You said you knew how much stuff to put in, and why didn't you wait until I was done talking? Alex wanted to know. That was the plan. You were supposed to surprise everyone else, but not me. George wanted to say that he was just as surprised as Alex, but that would sound ridiculous. So instead, he just said, it was just something that came over me. Now Alex laughed. It came over you, all right. He was looking at the big red stains on George's t-shirt. All over you. Oh, yeah, George agreed. My mom's going to freak. Chris held up the baseball. You want to practice some killer ball moves? Maybe we can finally beat Louis' team. Sure, George said. I'll be it and try to tag you with the ball. He stopped for a minute. I mean, if that's okay with you guys. It's cool, Alex said. I'll be it after you. And then me, Chris agreed. We're definitely getting better at this game, Alex said as he started to run away from the ball. Yeah, we are, George agreed. And now that he and Alex were talking again, he was feeling a lot better too. I love that they didn't let this little argument or pickle they were in go on too long. They took care of it, they talked about it, and they got through it, and they're still friends. All right, so that's the end of chapter 7. So chapter 8, what does it look like chapter 8 is going to be about? Make a prediction. What do you think in your head? Think about what you know, what we've been reading here in the book. Put it together. What do you see here? I see pictures of a stage and ropes and lights. Looks like he's got a headset on, headphones where he can talk to people. Did you say you think the chapter 8 might be about the school talent show coming up? Yeah, I think so. Let's keep reading and find out what happens at the talent show. Chapter 8. For the next week, the burps only came after George left school. Only one came when he was getting ready for bed, one in the storage room of his mom's craft store, and one while he was in the shower. That wasn't so bad. At least there hadn't been any burping at school, which was good because George had to spend a lot of extra time at school after classes learning how to work the curtains in the auditorium. George had signed up to work backstage during the talent show. He was in charge of the curtains. But when the runny noses went on stage, Alex was going to take over pulling the curtains. Oops, I missed a word. So, all week long, he and Alex had spent a lot of time with Mrs. Kelly. She showed them how to work the stage lights and pull the thick cords that lifted and lowered the stage curtains between acts. It wasn't as easy as it looked. George was taking it very seriously. There was no room for joking around backstage. Okay, who's next? Mrs. Kelly asked Alex as the backstage crew got ready for the next act to go on stage on the night of the talent show. Alex looked at his clipboard. Chris. It's my turn already? Chris asked. His face was ghost white. I can't do it. I'm too scared. What do you mean? George asked him. You've been practicing for 2 weeks, and your toilet man costume looks great. Your mom even bought you a new plunger. What if nobody likes my jokes? Chris said. They'll like them, George told him. Toilet man's funny, Alex agreed. But you guys are my friends, Chris said. There are a whole bunch of people out there I don't know. Sounds to me like maybe Chris has a little bit of stage fright. Have you ever had stage fright where you're a little bit afraid to get up on stage? I think it's a normal thing, you know. George thought for a minute. Then he said, they're people just like us. They put their underwear on one leg at a time. Chris stared at him. My dad said something like that to my mom when she had to make a speech to the PTA in my old school, George explained. The point is, if you picture the people in the audience in their underwear, they won't seem so scary. Chris started to laugh. What's so funny? Alex asked him. I'm picturing Mr. Trainer in tidy whities, Chris said. Mr. Trainer was their gym teacher. See, George told Chris, it's working already. Chris picked up his toilet seat shield, his plunger, his toilet brush, and a roll of toilet paper. Toilet man will not be flush, he said. The show must go on. George began to open the curtains. Go, toilet man! I know you'll bowl them over. Get it? Bowl, toilet bowl. Once the clapping for Chris stopped, George brought down the curtains. It was time for Sage and her friends to do their dance. The girls were all dressed in different colored leotards and tights. They were each supposed to be one of the four seasons. Up went the curtain again. George watched the girls wave their arms around and leap across the floor. It was boring, but watching was part of a curtain guy's job. As soon as the dance was over, he had to pull on the ropes and close the curtains. You know what I love about George is even though these other acts are a little bit boring to him, he's not too interested in them. He's still being respectful to those acts that are on stage, those people that are on stage doing their talent. I love that he's still showing them respect and still being quiet and doing his job the way he promised he would. That's a very responsible thing to do. So George watched as Sage jumped up high in the air. I'm sorry, I read wrong. Let me start over. So George watched as Sage jumped up high in her autumn costume and bashed Ariella in the nose. Nobody stopped dancing, even though Ariella's nose was bleeding all over the place. Wow, this is getting to be sort of entertaining after all. Then, right in the middle of the bloody ballet, George suddenly felt something weird happening in the bottom of his belly. There was a bubble there in there, a big bubble, and it was starting to jump around. Oh no, not the super burp, not now. The bubbles were already ping-ponging around in his stomach and threatening to move up into his chest. George gulped. This couldn't happen. Not in the middle of the talent show. There was no telling what his hands and feet would do if they got control of the curtains. Or worse, what if the super burp made him go out there and leap around with Sage and her friends? George had to beat the burp quickly. He shoved his whole fist in his mouth. There was no way the burp was getting past that. But the burp was strong, and it was determined. It kept bouncing and bouncing around. George used his free hand to pound his stomach, trying to pop that bubble from the outside. At just that moment, Louie, Max, and Mike walked over. Yo, what is the matter with you? Louie asked him. George didn't answer. He couldn't. He had his fist shoved in his mouth. Then suddenly George felt something go pop inside. Whoosh! It felt like all the air rushed right out of him. Yahoo! George had done it. He'd squelched the burp. George took his hand out of his mouth. He wiped his wet, spit-covered fingers on his jeans. Why were you sucking on your fingers? Louis asked. It's gross. Really gross, Max agreed. It's called a vocal exercise, George said quickly. You have to try and sing through your hand while tapping on your belly. There, that sounded believable, sort of. Yeah, well, don't do it again, Louis said. You look weird, and I don't want anyone thinking the runny noses are weird. No problem, George said. Just then, Alex came running over. He grabbed a hold of the ropes and began lowering the curtains on Sage, and her friends ran off stage. As it was his turn to be the curtain guy. That kind of looks like the word certain because C can make the S sound and the K sound, can't it? So the certain guy didn't make sense when I said that, so I tried the curtain guy. That made more sense because they're working with the curtain. Are you guys ready? Alex Asked the runny noses. George sure hopes so. Right. That's the end of chapter 8. So, what do you think is going to happen in chapter 9? Make a prediction. Maybe. We will see. So, let's think about what happened in chapters 7 and 8 as we read. In chapter 7, what happened? The volcano blew up, right? So he burped, George burped. He couldn't hold it in. He burped and kind of made some other people upset with him, disappointed, angry. So he got in a little bit of trouble with his super burp. And then in chapter 8, they went to the talent show, right? And so this talent show started. That was the next event in our plot. And I think we still all have all the same characters. We haven't had anybody new pop in. We're still working with characters like Mrs. Kelly, George, Alex, Louie, and their friends. Remember, the characters are the people or animals sometimes in a story. What's the setting for these two chapters? Yep, they're still at school. Yep, they're at school in the classroom and at the talent show in the auditorium. Let's see. So we added some things to the plot. Remember, the plot is all of the events that happen in the story. First, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. Last, this happens. So we know that George had a super burp, and they're playing at the talent show. The talent show has started, and we are in our seats, on the edge of our seats, waiting to see what happens at the talent show when the runny noses go on stage. All right. Any conflicts in those two chapters? Yeah, definitely. What was the big conflict in chapter 7? Yeah, the super burp, right? That was a big problem. Conflict is a problem. And so that conflict they had to deal with was he burped and then he didn't have control of himself. And so he poured the whole packet into the volcano and made a huge eruption, much more than they had planned on doing, and kind of upset his friend in the process. But he took care of that, didn't he? He talked to his friend and they worked it out and they're still friends. I like that they didn't let that ruin their friendship. So any conflicts in the second chapter that we read today, chapter 8? Any conflicts in there? They were at the talent show. He did start to have a little burp, didn't he? And then also a little teeny conflict in there was Chris was a little afraid to go on stage, wasn't he? So how did they solve that problem? He said, picture everybody in their underwear, their little shorts and t-shirts here, stuff they might sleep in, you know. Well, those two chapters were pretty good. And I am looking forward to chapter 9 and seeing how the runny noses perform in chapter 9. If you haven't already, like and subscribe to our channel, Teach Them How to Learn. And we will come back shortly with chapters 9 and 10. Sorry. Have a great day and thank you for spending your time with us.